This is episode 2 of the Integrative Consciousness podcast. Today we'll be talking to Rotem Petranker, the director of the Canadian Centre for Psychedelic Studies and the associate director of the Psychedelic Studies Research Program at the University of Toronto. This is our conversation.
So, Rotem, tell us a little bit more about your current projects.
Sure. My main project right now is the microdosing trial that I've been working on for a few years. It's been kind of difficult for a variety of logistical reasons, mostly. Like the design has been ready for a few years. But I think initially we were kind of too ahead of the curve. Health Canada wasn't willing to hear any of it. It was difficult to find a company to formulate psilocybin for us. But now we are currently recruiting participants for this trial. So currently we're at the pre-screening stage, so it's just a few questions, but hopefully soon we will start actually bringing people into the lab. So that's very exciting, and it's taking up a lot of my time. I'm working on a couple of other papers. I've recently become more interested in discussing the philosophy of science in the context of psychedelics. I think it's really lacking. So that's something that I feel strongly about. I think a lot of scientists just don't think about what they're doing, and it causes problems later in terms of the way studies are designed, the way statistical analysis is performed, the way people infer from their data. So I think that's kind of risky. I'm happy to talk about that more. I also started doing a lot more therapy than I was doing before. So previously I was just, I was a trainee, and now I find therapy to be very rewarding. I really like working with people. It's nice to help people directly rather than sit around and write papers. So that's something that I'm enjoying a lot, and feels very rewarding. There are a couple of surveys that are on the go that I think the time is kind of past for surveys in psychedelics. I think we should be doing lab work, but I'm supporting other people that want to do it. Yeah, and I'm applying for funding for a couple of projects that if the funding comes through, then I think we have some really interesting opportunities. I want to work on a paper that would include a lot of the way Canadians think about psychedelics, because I think that right now this information is really lacking. And I think our policymakers are largely driven either by their own notions or, sadly, by lobbyists that get paid so that things go a certain way. And I have some real concerns about how legalization is going to go. So I think that as a scientist, I have a certain level of responsibility to the public to inform policymakers. But yeah, that depends on funding.
So it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts, especially with your microdosing, so your biggest project at the moment, where you're concerned about the design and you're moving into pre-screening. Is that correct?
So we're already pre-screening. I actually have not looked in the last couple of weeks at how many people have filled out the pre-screen, but I expect we have a lot of people already.
But in terms of your main project in the microdosing study, the design is in place and you're currently pre-screening. You mentioned that there's a lot of moving parts with lobbyists, with policymakers. How do you think we might be able to address that challenge then?
The challenge being
having lobbyists push policies
oh
into
yeah,
the way that they would benefit from, as
this
opposed to the
is
researcher.
this is a great question. I think it's above my pay grade. This is a question for people who understand politics. I can tell you that as far as I know, we made lobbying illegal in Canada some years ago, and now they're called government relations experts. So I don't know that there's really a way around it, but I also believe that many of the people who go into politics do it for the right reasons. So it is my belief, at least, that if we can inform them, if we can show them the science, then that could affect the way they think about things, maybe as much as, whatever presents lobbyists give.
So it sounds like when you started this psychedelic journey and psychedelic research in general, you were stepping your toes into a bunch of different pools. Now with policy, now with psychedelics and moving the science forward. And it seems that the only way to move the science forward, or yes, to move the science forward, is to have findings that show the benefit of psychedelics. Is that the case?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think what we need is, so I think a lot of the problem with especially psychedelic science is the people are either unaware of their biases or don't care about their biases. Most of the people in this area are psychedelics enthusiasts. They want to show that it works. And that is not the scientific approach. The scientific approach is to see whether it works, to see whether it's safe. And I think that we should be, that's the way we should be doing the science. So yeah, I think for psychedelics to become a legitimate part of the public sphere, we need to first make sure that they do no harm, or if there are harms, which is perfectly fine, we need to make sure that the benefit it greatly outweighs the harms. So, there's a lot of drugs that are off the shelf, could be very dangerous. You could die if you take too many Advils. So there's no doubt that psychedelics are safe compared to that. But I think that if we just forge ahead, completely ignoring the potential harms, then we're doing a disservice to future generations. And this is like, excuse me, I'm not even talking about concerns around, unethical administration of psychedelics, about all these sexual harassment cases. So many things can go wrong. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about just the substance itself outside of its implementation. So I think we need to be very, very careful. And I think if you consider what happened last time when psychedelics were popular, people were increasingly careless. And then eventually when the government decided it's time to crack down and make psychedelics illegal, we didn't really have any good science to say, look, but we have looked into it and this is the good, this is the bad. And so I think what we should be doing is preparing for the time that may or may not come where regulators will say, yeah, the public opinion tide is swayed the other way and we're going to criminalize it. And at that moment, we need to have science that is beyond reproach.
So my takeaways from that are addressing our initial biases. So again, those psychedelic enthusiasts who want to vouch for psychedelics as this amazing cure to all these things is the wrong approach. But instead, having it look at it from the other side and consider psychedelics as substances that might be harmful. And again, like you said, that might be okay, or that will be okay, even if they do have harms, because medicines on the shelf today, as you mentioned, Advils, could be deadly if you take too many. So taking that approach or looking at psychedelics from that scientific approach to question it, not to kind of fall into the trap of thinking this will be the medicine that will cure it all.
Yeah, we need to be, that's right. We need to be critical thinkers in everything we do.
Do you find that sense of critical thinking and logical reasoning has fallen out of the kind of academic scientific sphere?
Honestly, had we had this conversation 2 weeks ago, I would have said, yeah, and there's no rationality left. But I went to a really good conference last weekend called Psychedemia in Ohio State. And I met a lot of very interesting, very critical people. And I think it was my impression, I guess, that a lot of the people who are already established in the field, yeah, they don't care. And they're getting rich off of this, and yeah, they're not going to change their minds. Also, I think it's a matter of the way science has been done for a long time, which has led to the replication crisis, which is a whole other can of worms. And so I think for a lot of people, they don't care because they're already they're on top, they're getting paid, they're living their best lives. But what I heard from a lot of junior researchers is that, yes, they are critical, they are concerned, they are familiar with many of the critiques that I leveled, and I learned a lot about other things that I didn't even think about that we should care about.
What were those other things that you should care about, if you can remember off the top of your head?
Sure, I think so. I don't want to pat myself on the back. I don't want to be too self-congratulatory, but the most obvious one is equity in research. We need to include everyone as much as we can. Um, and I think this is a scientific consideration because if we want to have ecological validity, if we want to be able to infer from our results of the general population, we need a sample that resembles the general population. But it's also about, we're giving out something that could really change people's lives for the better. So not just white guys who are wealthy should have access to it. And the reason I said I don't want to be too self-congratulatory is because this is something I actually kind of already thought about. So the design for our study is once a week microdose rather than twice a week, which is the more popular protocol. And that's because we're going to do it on the weekend. We wanted people who have jobs and may not be able to take a bunch of days off just to participate in a trial. So this is something I didn't even think about. I was just like, obviously, like this is for convenience sake for me, but I didn't consider how this has material impact on people's lives. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So I think just to rephrase what you just mentioned, from this conference, one of the biggest things that kind of isn't being considered is equity in the research and making sure that our population or our samples are representative of the populations that we hope these medicines work for.
Yeah.
And in your case, in your microdosing study, you'll be using a once a week microdosing session on the weekends. So how does that play into when, I guess, in terms of equity, bring back that topic for people who work on weekends? Is that going to be something that's considered, or now I'm just poking holes in your
No, it's
design
fine. That's reasonable. I mean, this is the decision we made. I've had another thing that we can't have is people who work night shifts because we want them to show up to the study and be alert because we're going to test a bunch of measures. So yes, it will not include everyone, but the idea here was to include people who are normally excluded. Normally, the people in these studies, well, I mean, it depends on if you consider MDMA psychedelic, but if you don't, normally the people participating in these studies are people who can take a bunch of time off. And this is, so we want to include, regular Joes and Janes. I'm also hopeful because Toronto is such a multicultural city. It's the most multicultural city in the world. I'm hoping that we get a good representation from different backgrounds because, so I am Jewish, and I don't know if you or your listeners know, but Jews have a lot of potential genetic diseases. And so it might be, for example, the Jewish people metabolize psychedelics differently. It might be that East Asian people metabolize psychedelics differently. So I think that's another thing that we really should be looking into.
Okay, so that kind of brings up my next question. So again, for those who are just tuning in, your work mainly focuses on microdosing. So if these treatments do produce meaningful results, how might these treatments take form as a personalized medicine? So again, considering these genetic differences, but what other differences would you consider when thinking of psychedelics as a personalized medicine?
That's a really good question. And if you answer it, you will probably be rich because we don't know yet. With almost every other substance we're familiar with, it goes by body weight. The bigger you are, the more of the drug you need. But in the case of psychedelics, that does not appear to be a meaningful predictor. There's a paper from 2021, Garcia Ramo et al., where they looked at all the psychedelic studies and they saw that there's really no difference in outcome between just giving people a set relatively large dose or dosing by weight. So it's not about body weight. There were a couple of private companies that were looking into whether genetic testing is predictive because there are a couple of specific alleles that code for the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the one that's most relevant for psychedelics. I don't know that they came up with anything, which is, to me, was very surprising. I thought that's where it's at. So assuming that genetic differences aren't the magic bullet, and assuming that it's not body weight, I think that it would have to be some kind of a psychological individual differences approach. This is a project that I would absolutely love to do. It would be difficult and costly because the way to do it is like you would have to develop a new questionnaire. And to do that, you need to run a lot of participants, and you need to first ask them, like, you need the processes. You come up with a theory, and then you create a bunch of questions based on a theory, and then you ask questions, and then you have them go through the intervention, in this case, use psychedelics, and then you see if any of the questions were predictive of the experience. But you need a lot of participants for this. You would need hundreds of participants. So that's maybe a pipe dream.
So it sounds like you're on the verge of answering the $1 million question here.
Oh, I'm very far. This would be many millions, and I wouldn't, if there's funding, I think it's doable, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the challenge with receiving the funding, given that they're tied to some of these policymakers and bureaucrats, would make it difficult to receive that funding on your end. Is that the case?
So because I started early, I can tell you that for sure, early on, no one would hear any of what I had to say. No one would give me money. This year, actually, in a couple of months is the deadline for there's a CHR. They're going to give 3 grants for psilocybin assisted psychotherapy. And so that's great. It's a lot of money. Each of them is $1 million. But I think that this kind of ties into the biomedical model of mental health. They're only looking at how can we make people who are suffering and can't go to work into people who suffer less and go to work. And I think it does not address any of the flourishing questions. How can we have people who live good, meaningful lives? Or what are the mechanisms? It's just like, does it work? But we already kind of know that it works. So these questions are relevant for like 5 years ago.
And it kind of goes against the tide of doing the research with logical critical thinking and logical reasoning, because here, I guess, in the biomedical model, they're trying to just find a solution that works. Is that the case?
Yeah, I don't know if they're at odds with each other. I think it's more like this is the thinking of a clinician or an engineer. It's like, I have a problem, I need it fixed. If a little bit of gum and a little bit of tape is gonna solve my problem, I'm good. I don't need to know how it works.
To me, it kind of sounds like they're taking a blind eye.
They care less about mechanisms.
Yes. So it does sound like it's an expensive thing to answer this, an expensive process to answer this question of personalized medicine, because developing the questionnaire, testing all these people. Do you think that grant of about $1 million is enough runway to do something like that, or no?
It depends on the kind of infrastructure you have, because if you're out of a hospital where people get paid anyway, then I think it's totally doable. But it has been my experience running an independent study that everything is really expensive. You got to get insurance, and that's expensive. You have to pay people. You have to pay for the space. Those things really rack up quickly. So I think it would depend on who you are and where you're located. Kind of a pretty standard privilege question.
Okay, so depending on whether you're an independent researcher or if you're in that medical space at a hospital. So we've kind of touched upon this, but psychedelic applications fall into 2 categories. There are the clinical applications, so things like smoking cessation, PTSD, using psychedelics to treat those, and those kind of flourishing applications that you mentioned, things like well-being, creativity, and intelligence. Which side does your research entertain? And then I'd like to ask a little bit as to why you chose that side.
Right. I was mostly interested in flourishing. My perspective is that, I mean, we are not stopping climate change, for example. There's a lot of things we're just like, it's here to stay. We need to find a way to live with it. And so I think the question now is not how do we remove the bad stuff, it's how do we add good stuff. We need to find new solutions. So that was kind of my thinking when I wanted to focus more on flourishing. However, the biomedical model being what it is, and funding being what it is, if you want to get funded, you need to focus on a clinical indication. So this microdosing trial will, we're only recruiting people with persistent depressive disorder. But then we're going to test a bunch of essentially flourishing aspects of their experience, like creativity, like mindfulness, sociability, a lot of different things. Because that's actually what I am interested in, because I want to see if we can, I think that it's not that there's a continuum between feeling bad and feeling okay. I think that it's a more complex kind of, maybe there's two axes, maybe they're completely, or I guess they're completely orthogonal. And this is the approach of a therapy method called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which I really like. Sometimes, for example, you have chronic pain and it's going to stay with you, and that's very unfortunate, but you need to find a way to live a good life even with chronic pain. So the question is not how are we going to get rid of the pain, the question is how are we going to add good things to life so that life is worth living. And so that seems to help a lot of people. And I think the same goes for depression. A lot of the time it's not about, say, how can I not be sad? It's about how can I still be happy, or how can I find things that are meaningful to me that I want to do.
Your research does want to entertain that flourishing aspect, but because of the challenges with funding, you have to pull in some sort of clinical application as well. So in your microdosing study, you'll be pulling into the persistent depressive disorder. And then you mentioned ACT therapy, something you're leaning towards as a sort of clinical technique. And maybe we'll touch upon that in a little bit. I guess the premise here is finding a way to kind of cope with those negative experiences. So as you mentioned, maybe like chronic pain, it's not how can we remove the pain, but how can we live our lives happily, although we still face this pain. So are there other techniques in terms of clinical work that you consider or you are interested in at the moment?
I mean, yeah, I've been most of the clinical, so when I do therapy, I do emotion focused therapy, which I really like. I think I was quite skeptical of it initially, but I think that there's one of the maxims of emotion focused therapy is that our feelings are wise. And I think that there are things that, and had I heard this like 5 years ago, I would have said this is complete nonsense. But I think that there are aspects of our consciousness that we just have no access to, because we need to be in control. We need to be smart. We need to go through our day and do the work. And when we allow ourselves to really feel stuff and just go into it, then we can uncover parts of our consciousness that are affecting us. They're not dormant, but we can't really reach them as they are. I think it's kind of like, you can't think your way out of a problem that you thought yourself into. You need to come up with something that's outside of your thinking. And I think that actually is quite similar to the way psychedelics work, right? It's like you need to, normally you have your one way of looking at things, and when you use psychedelics a lot of the time, it loosens your constraints a little bit. It allows you to rethink the issues that you're trying to deal with, and this fresh perspective could help. And in a similar way, feeling your way through things rather than thinking your way through things could give you fresh perspective.
So your focus is, or I guess the techniques that you're leaning towards are emotional or emotion focused techniques where we feel the feelings. Is that?
Yeah, well, that's part. So I was trained and as an client centered, which is kind of an integrative model where you you take a bunch of different types or modalities of therapy and you make them work together and you tailor something for each client. So yeah, emotion focused therapy, also ACT. CBT is really, really useful. There's a reason why it's been around for so long for managing symptoms. But yeah, for depth work, I think EFT is really, really good.